Hi everyone. Well, no one, just me. I'm going to just change this up a little bit. There we go. So, why am I doing this as a live stream? The reason I'm doing this as a live stream is so that I don't have to upload it. The last time I've read books and put them on YouTube, the uploading time takes so long. I thought I would just do it live and it uploads as we're going along. There might be buffering. It's not going to be professional, but how exciting is this? When I was doing some research for our quiz that we have every Saturday night, 7 o'clock UK time, I discovered that Mary Shelley had written an apocalyptic fantasy called The Last Man. And surprisingly, I think I'm right in saying I don't even think Mark had heard of it. So, rather excitingly, I bought it and it's just come through the post. So this is hot off the press. So The Last Man, Mary Shelley. The Last Man is Mary Shelley's apocalyptic fantasy of the end of human civilization. Set in the late 21st century, the novel unfolds a somber and pessimistic vision of mankind confronting inevitable destruction. Interwoven with her futuristic theme, Mary Shelley incorporates idealized portraits of Shelley and Byron, yet rejects romanticism and its faith in art and nature. So, well, we love an apocalyptic dystopian novel in this house. So I'm going to have to keep stopping to have sips of coffee and tea and water, as I'm not really 100% over that bad cold I had. So, bit of a terrifying cover. Can you even see that? Let's begin. So, author's introduction. I said to Mark, do I read that? He said it might be interesting. I said, all right, it might be interesting. So I'll read it for you guys. So this is the author's introduction. I visited Naples in the year 1818 on the 8th of December of that year. My companion and I crossed the bay to visit the antiquities which are scattered on the shores of Bay. I probably said that wrong. The translucent and shining waters of the calm sea covered fragments of old Roman villas, which were interlaced by seaweed and received diamond tints from the checkering of the sunbeams. The blue and pellucid element was such as Galatea might have skimmed in her car of mother of pearl, or Cleopatra, more fitly than the Nile, have chosen as the path of her magic ship. Though it was winter, the atmosphere seemed more appropriate to early spring, and its genial warmth contributed to inspire those sensations of placid delight, which are the portion of every traveller, as he lingers, loath to quit the tranquil bays and radiant promontories of Bay. We visited the so-called Elysian Fields and Avernus, and sorry if I'm saying all this wrong, Avernus, and wandered through various ruined temples, baths, and classic spots. At length we entered the gloomy cavern of the Cumaean Sibyl. Our Lazzaroni bore flaring torches and shone red and almost dusky in the murky subterranean passages, whose darkness, thirstily surrounding them, seemed eager to imbibe more and more of the element of light. We passed by a natural archway, leading to a second gallery, and inquired if we could not enter there also. The guides pointed to the reflection of their torches on the water that paved it, leaving us to form our own conclusion, but adding it was a pity, for it led to the Sibyl's cave. Our curiosity and enthusiasm were excited by this circumstance, and we insisted upon attempting the passage. As is usually the case, in the prosecution of such enterprises. The difficulties decreased on examination. We found on each side of the humid pathway dry land for the sole of the foot. At length we arrived at a large deserted dark cavern, which the Lazzaroni assured us was the Sibyl's cave. We were sufficiently disappointed, yet we examined it with care, as if its blank rocky walls could still bear trace of celestial visitant. On one side was a small opening. "Whither does this lead?" we asked. "Can we enter here?" "Questo può no," said the wild-looking savage who held the torch. "You can advance but a short distance, and nobody visits it." "Nevertheless, I will try it," said my companion. "It may lead to the real cavern. Shall I go alone, or will you accompany me?" I signified my readiness to proceed, but our guides protested against such a measure. With great volubility in their native Neapolitan dialect, with which we were not very familiar, they told us that there were spectres, and the roof would fall in, that it was too narrow to admit us, that there was a deep hole within, filled with water, and we might be drowned. My friend shortened the harangue by taking the man's torch from him, and we proceeded alone. The passage, which at first scarcely admitted us, quickly grew narrower and lower. We were almost bent double, yet still we persisted in making our way through it. At length we entered a wider space, and the low roof heightened. But as we congratulated ourselves on this change, our torch was extinguished by a current of air, and we were left in utter darkness. The guides bring with them materials for renewing the light, but we had none. Our only resource was to return as we came. We groped round the widened space to find the entrance, and after a time fancied that we had succeeded. This proved, however, to be a second passage, which evidently ascended. It terminated like the former, through something approaching to a ray. We could not tell whence, shed a very doubtful twilight in the space. By degrees our eyes grew somewhat accustomed to the dimness, and we perceived there was no direct passage leading us further, but what it was possible to climb one side of the cavern to a low arch at top, which promised a more easy path, from whence we now discovered that this light proceeded. With considerable difficulty we scrambled up and came to another passage with still more of illumination, and this led to another ascent like the former. After a succession of these, which our resolution alone permitted us to surmount, we arrived at a wide cavern with an arched dome-like roof. An aperture in the midst let in the light of heaven, but this was overgrown with brambles and underwood, which acted as a veil, obscuring the day and giving a solemn religious hue to the apartment. It was spacious and nearly circular, with a raised seat of stone about the size of a Grecian couch at one end. The only sign that life had been here was the perfect snow-white skeleton of a goat, which had probably not perceived the opening as it grazed on the hill above and had fallen headlong. Ages perhaps had elapsed since this catastrophe, and the ruin it had made above had been repaired by the growth of vegetation during the many hundred summers. The rest of the furniture of the cavern consisted of piles of leaves, fragments of bark, and a white, filmy substance resembling the inner part of the green hood which shelters the grain of the unripe Indian corn. We were fatigued by our struggles to attain this point, and seated ourselves on the rocky couch, while the sounds of tinkling sheep bells and shout of shepherd boy reached us from above. At length my friend, who had taken up some of the leaves strewed about, exclaimed, "This is the Sibyl's cave. These are Sibylline leaves." On exclamation, we found that all the leaves, bark, and other substances were traced with written characters. What appeared to us more astonishing was that these writings were expressed in various languages, some unknown to my companion, ancient Chaldee and Egyptian hieroglyphics, old as the pyramids. Stranger still, some were in modern dialects, English and Italian. We could make out little by the dim light, but they seemed to contain prophecies, detailed relations of events but lately past, names now well known, but of modern date, and often exclamations of exultations or woe, of victory or defeat, were traced on their thin, scant pages. This was certainly the Sibyl's Cave, not indeed exactly as Virgil describes it, but the whole of this land had been so convulsed by earthquake and volcano that the change was not wonderful, though the traces of ruin were effaced by time, and we probably owed the preservation of these leaves to the accident which had closed the mouth of the cavern, and the swift growing vegetation which had rendered its sole opening impervious to the storm. We made a hasty selection of such of the leaves, whose writing one at least of us could understand, and then, laden with our treasure, we bade adieu to the dim hypotheric cavern, and after much difficulty succeeded in rejoining our guides. During our stay at Naples, we often returned to this cave, sometimes alone, skimming the sunlit sea, and each time added to our store. Since that period, whenever the world's circumstance has not imperilously called me away, or the temper of my mind impeded such study, I have been employed in deciphering these sacred remains. Their meaning, wondrous and eloquent, has often repaid my toil, soothing me in sorrow, and exciting my imagination to daring flights through the immensity of nature and the mind of man. For a while my labours were not solitary, but that time is gone, and with the selected and matchless companion of my toils, their dearest reward is also lost to me. I present the public with my latest discoveries in the slight Sibylline pages, scattered and unconnected as they were. I have been obliged to add links and model the work into a consistent form, but the main substance rests on the truths contained in these poetic rhapsodies and the divine intuition with the Cimmerian damsel obtained from heaven. I have often wondered at the subject of her verses and at the English dress of the Latin poet. Sometimes I have thought that, obscure and chaotic as they are, they owe their present form to me, their decipherer, as if we should give to another artist the painted fragments which from the mosaic copy of Raphael's Transfiguration in St. Peter's, he would put them together in a form whose mode would be fashioned by his own peculiar mind and talent. Doubtless the leaves of the Cimmerian Sibyl have suffered distortion and diminution of interest and excellence in my hands. My only excuse for thus transforming them is that they were unintelligible in their pristine condition. My labours have cheered long hours of solitude and taken me out of a world which has averted its once benignant face from me to one glowing with imagination and power. Will my readers ask how I could find solace from the narration of misery and woeful change? This is one of the mysteries of our nature, which holds full sway over me, and from whose influence I cannot escape. I confess that I have not been unmoved by the development of the tale, and that I have been depressed, nay, agonized at some parts of the recital which I have faithfully transcribed from my materials. Yet such is human nature, that the excitement of mind was dear to me, and that the imagination, painter of tempest and earthquake, or worse, the stormy and ruin-fraught passions of man, softened my real sorrows and endless regrets, by clothing these fictitious ones in that ideality which takes the mortal sting from pain. I hardly know whether this apology is necessary, for the merits of my adaptation and translation must decide how far I have well bestowed my time and imperfect powers in giving them and substance to the frail and attenuated leaves of the Sibyl. So that was Mary Shelley's introduction to the book, the apocalyptic fantasy about the end of civilization. That was her introduction. So we're going to actually start the book now. I need a drink. Bear with. How interesting is that, though? So she went to Naples, went into this Sibyl's Cave, found these leaves with all this writing on, and here's Mark.
Hello. very much enjoyed the introduction. Just making a guest appearance to see if I can take the charger. I'm so sorry to interrupt this beautiful
You've
thing.
ruined it.
I chose a natural break.
I've only got half myself left.
Oh, blooming hell. I'll bring it back in a minute.
Do you see what I've got to put up with in this house?
Oh, this is doing it live.
See, people who know us expect this kind of unprofessionalism.
Inimitable style.
There might be people here that don't realise that we're unprofessional. It was perfectly professional until he walked in.
No, it's all going very well.
Bring it back because I'm running out myself. Bloody hell. Bloody Joe Rowan didn't have to put up with this nonsense. So basically, I've just read Mary Shelley's introduction to her apocalyptic tale, The Last Man, which basically said she went to Naples, went into Sybil's cave, and found the prophetic writings on leaves of paper that she then stole and turned into this book. So that was fascinating in itself, the story behind this. So if I cut out, it's because my husband stole my charger. But, I never promised perfection or professionalism, did I? If you're wondering why I haven't got the chat box on, it's because I'm not sure if I've got any of me people with spanners here. And I can't keep an eye on the chat box when I'm reading. And I'm quite a sensitive soul. So if anybody starts being rude to me, I'll probably cry, and I don't have a spanner. So we're going to move on. Moving on. Ugh, that water's horrible. Chapter 1. The Last Man by Mary Shelley. I am the native of a sea-surrounded nook, a cloud in shadowed land, which, when the surface of the globe, with its shoreless ocean and trackless continents, presents itself to my mind, appears only as an inconsiderable speck in the immense whole. And yet, when balanced in the scale of mental power, far outweighed countries of larger extent and more numerous population. So true it is that man's mind alone was the creator of all that was good or great to man, and that nature herself was only his first minister. England, seated far north in the turbid sea, now visits my dreams in the semblance of a vast and well-manned ship, which mastered the winds and rode proudly over the waves. In my boyish days, she was the universe to me, when I stood on my native hills and saw plain and mountain stretch out to the utmost limits of my vision, speckled by the dwellings of my countrymen, and subdued to fertility by their labours. The earth's very centre was fixed for me in that spot, and the rest of her orb was a fable. To have forgotten which would have cost neither my imagination nor understanding an effort. My fortunes have been, from the beginning, an exemplification of the power that mutability may possess over the varied tenor of man's life. With regard to myself, this came almost by inheritance. My father was one of those men on whom nature had bestowed to prodigality the envied gifts of wit and imagination, and then left his bark of life to be impelled by these winds without adding reason as the rudder, or judgment as the pilot for the voyage. His extraction was obscure, but circumstances brought him early into public notice, and his small paternal property was soon dissipated in the splendid scene of fashion and luxury in which he was an actor. During the short years of thoughtless youth, he was adored by the high-bred triflers of the day, nor least by the youthful sovereign, who escaped from the intrigues of party and the arduous duties of kingly business to find never-failing amusement and exhilaration of spirit in his society. My father's impulses, never under his own control, perpetually led him into difficulties from which his ingenuity alone could extricate him, and the accumulating pile of debts of honour and of trade, which would have bent to earth any other, was supported by him with a light spirit and tameless hilarity, while his company was so necessary at the tables and assemblies of the rich, that his derelictions were considered venial, and he himself received with intoxicating flattery. This kind of popularity, like every other, is evanescent, and the difficulties of every kind with which he had to contend increased in a frightful ratio compared with his small means of extricating himself. At such times, the king, in his enthusiasm for him, would come to his relief, and then kindly take his friend to task. My father gave the best promises for amendment, but his social disposition, his craving for the usual diet of admiration, and more than all, the fiend of gambling which fully possessed him, made his good resolutions transient, his promises vain. With the quick sensibility peculiar to his temperament, he perceived his power in the brilliant circle to be on the wane. The king married, and the haughty princess of Austria, who became, as Queen of England, the head of fashion, looked with harsh eyes on his defects, and with contempt on the affection her royal husband entertained for him. My father felt his fall this was near, but so far from profiting by this last calm before the storm to save himself, he sought to forget anticipated evil by making still greater sacrifices to the deity of pleasure, deceitful and cruel arbiter of his destiny. The king, who was a man of excellent dispositions, but easily led, had now become a willing disciple of his imperious consort. He was induced to look with extreme disapprobation, and at last with distaste, on my father's imprudence and follies. It is true that his presence dissipated these clouds. His warm-hearted frankness, brilliant sallies, and confiding demeanour were irresistible. It was only when, at a distance, while still renewed tales of his errors were poured into his royal friend's ear, that he lost his influence. The Queen's dexterous management was employed to prolong these absences and gather together accusations. At length, the King was brought to see in him a source of perpetual disquiet, knowing that he should pay for the short-lived pleasure of his society by tedious homilies and more painful narrations of excess, the truth of which he could not disprove. The result was that he would make one more attempt to reclaim him, and in case of ill success, cast him off forever. Such a scene must have been one of the deepest interest and high-wrought passion. A powerful king, conspicuous for a goodness which had heretofore made him meek, and now lofty in his admonitions, with alternate entreaty and reproof, besought his friend to attend to his real interests. Resolutely to avoid these fascinations, which in fact were fast deserting him, and to spend his great powers on a worthy field, in which he, his sovereign, would be his prop, his stay, and his pioneer. My father felt this kindness for a moment. Ambitious dreams floated before him, and he thought that it would be well to exchange his present pursuits for nobler duties. With sincerity and fervour, he gave the required promise as a pledge of continued favour. He received from his royal master a sum of money to defray pressing debts and enable him to enter under good auspices his new career. That very night, while yet full of gratitude and good resolves, this whole sum and its amount doubled was lost at the gambling table. In his desire to repair his first losses, my father risked double stakes, and thus incurred a debt of honour he was wholly unable to pay. Ashamed to apply again to the king, he turned his back upon London, its false delights and clinging miseries, and with poverty for his sole companion, buried himself in solitude among the hills and lakes of Cumberland. His wit, his bon mot, the record of his personal attractions, fascinating manners, and social talents were long remembered and repeated from mouth to mouth. Ask where now was this favourite of fashion, this companion of the noble, this excelling beam, which gilt with alien splendour the assemblies of the courtly and the gay. You heard that he was under a cloud, a lost man, not one thought it belonged to him to repay pleasure by real services, or that his long reign of brilliant wit deserved a pension on retiring. The king lamented his absence. He loved to repeat his sayings, relate the adventures they had had together, and exalt his talents. But here ended his reminiscence. Bear with. Meanwhile, my father, forgotten, could not forget. He repined for the loss of what was more necessary to him than air or food. The excitements of pleasure, the admiration of the noble, the luxurious and polished living of the great. A nervous fever was the consequence, during which he was nursed by the daughter of a poor cottager, under whose roof he lodged. She was lovely, gentle, and above all kind to him. Nor can it afford astonishment that the late idol of high-bred beauty should, even in a fallen state, appear a being of an elevated and wondrous nature to the lowly cottage girl. The attachment between them led to the ill-fated marriage, of which I was the offspring. Notwithstanding the tenderness and sweetness of my mother, her husband still deplored his degraded state. Unaccustomed to industry, he knew not in what way to contribute to support his increasing family. Sometimes he thought of applying to the king. Pride and shame for a while withheld him, and before his necessities became so imperious as to compel him to some kind of exertion, he died. For one brief interval before this catastrophe, he looked forward to the future and contemplated with anguish the desolate situation in which his wife and children would be left. His last effort was a letter to the king, full of touching eloquence and of occasional flashes of that brilliant spirit which was an integral part of him. He bequeathed his widow and orphans to the friendship of the royal master, and felt satisfied that, by this means, their prosperity was better assured in his death than in his life. This letter was enclosed to the care of a nobleman, who, he did not doubt, would perform the last and inexpensive office of placing it in the king's own hand. He died in debt, and his little property was seized immediately by his creditors. My mother, penniless and burthened with 2 children, waited week after week and month after month in sickening expectation of a reply, which never came. She had no experience beyond her father's cottage, and the mansion of the lord of the manor was the chiefest type of grandeur she could conceive. During my father's life, she had been made familiar with the name of royalty and the courtly circle, but such things, ill according with her personal experience, appeared, after the loss of him who gave substance and reality to them, vague and fantastical. If, under any circumstances, she could have acquired sufficient courage to address the noble persons mentioned by her husband, the ill success of his own application caused her to banish the idea. She saw, therefore, to escape from dire penury, perpetual care, joined to sorrow for the loss of the wondrous being whom she continued to contemplate with ardent admiration. Hard labour and naturally delicate health at length released her from the sad continuity of want and misery. Let me have a drink. The condition of her orphan children was peculiarly desolate. Her own father had been an emigrant from another part of the country, and had died long since. They had no one relation to take them by the hand. They were outcasts, paupers, unfriended beings, to whom the most scanty pittance was a matter of favour, and who were treated merely as children of peasants, yet poorer than the poorest, who, dying, had left them a thankless bequest to the close-handed charity of the land. I, the elder of the 2, was 5 years old when my mother died. A remembrance of the discourses of my parents and the communications which my mother endeavoured to impress upon me concerning my father's friends, in slight hope that I might one day derive benefit from the knowledge, floated like an indistinct dream through my brain. I conceived that I was different and superior to my protectors and companions, but I knew not how or wherefore. The sense of injury associated with the name of king and noble clung to me, but I could draw no conclusions from such feelings to serve as a guide to action. My first real knowledge of myself was an unprotected orphan among the valleys and fells of Cumberland. I was in the service of a farmer, and with crook in hand, my dog at my side, I shepherded a numerous flock on near uplands. I cannot say much in praise of such a life, and its pains far exceeded its pleasures. There was freedom in it, a companionship with nature, and a reckless loneliness. But these, romantic as they were, did not accord with the love of action and desire of human sympathy characteristic of youth. Neither the care of my flock nor the change of seasons were sufficient to tame my eager spirit. My outdoor life and unemployed time were the temptations that led me early into lawless habits. I associated with others, friendless like myself. I formed them into a band. I was their chief and captain. All shepherd boys alike, while our flocks were spared over the pastures, we schemed and executed many a mischievous prank, which drew on us the anger and revenge of the rustics. I was the leader and protector of my comrades, and as I became distinguished among them, their misdeeds were usually visited upon me. But while I endured punishment and pain in their defence with the spirit of a hero, I claimed as my reward their praise and obedience. In such a school, my disposition became rugged but firm. The appetite for admiration and small capacity for self-control, which I inherited from my father, nursed by adversity, made me daring and reckless. I was rough as the elements and unlearned as the animals I tended. I often compared myself to them, and finding that my chief superiority consisted in power, I soon persuaded myself that it was in power only that I was inferior to the chiefest potents of the earth. Thus, untaught in refined philosophy, and pursued by a reckless feeling of degradation from my true station in society, I wandered among the hills of civilized England as uncouth a savage as the wolf-bred founder of old Rome. I owned but one law. It was that of the strongest, and my greatest deed of virtue was never to submit. Yet let me a little retreat from this sentence. I have passed on myself. My mother, when dying, had, in addition to her other half-forgotten and misapplied lessons, committed with solemn exhortation her other child to my fraternal guardianship. And this one duty I performed to the best of my ability, with all the zeal and affection of which my nature was capable. I'm going to have a little drink. My sister was 3 years younger than myself. I had nursed her as an infant, and when the difference of our sexes, by giving us various occupations, in a great measure divided us, yet she continued to be the object of my careful love. Orphans in the fullest sense of the term, we were poorest among the poor, and despised among the unhonoured. If my daring and courage obtained for me a kind of respectful aversion, her youth and sex, since they did not excite tenderness by proving her to be weak, were the causes of numberless mortifications to her, and her own disposition was not so constituted as to diminish the evil effects of her lowly station. She was a singular being, and, like me, inherited much of the peculiar disposition of our father. Her countenance was all expression. Her eyes were not dark, but impenetrably deep. You seemed to discover space after space in their intellectual glance, and to feel that the soul, which was their soul, comprehended a universe of thought in its ken. She was pale and fair, and her golden hair clustered on her temples, contrasting its rich hue with the living marble beneath. Her coarse peasant dress, little consonant apparently with the refinement of feeling which her face expressed, yet in strange manner accorded with it. She was like one of Guido's saints, and heaven in her heart and in her look, so that when you saw her, you only thought of that within, and costume and even feature were secondary to the mind that beamed in her countenance. Yet though lovely and full of noble feeling, my poor Perdita, for that was the fanciful name my sister had received from her dying parent, was not altogether saintly in her disposition. Her manners were cold and repulsive. If she had been nurtured by those who had regarded her with affection, she might have been different. But unloved and neglected, she repaid want of kindness with distrust and silence. She was submissive to those who held authority over her, but a perpetual cloud dwelt on her brow. She looked as if she expected enmity from every one who approached her, and her actions were instigated by the same feeling. All the time she could command she spent in solitude. She would ramble to the most unfrequented places and scale dangerous heights, that in those unvisited spots she might wrap herself in loneliness. Often she passed whole hours walking up and down the paths of the woods. She wove garlands of flowers and ivy, or watched the flickering of the shadows and glancing of the leaves. Sometimes she sat beside a stream, and as her thoughts paused, threw flowers or pebbles into the waters, watching how those swam and these sank. Or she would set afloat boats formed of bark or trees or leaves, with a feather for a sail, and intensely watch the navigation of her craft among the rapids and shallows of a brook. Meanwhile, her active fancy wove 1,000 combinations. She dreamt of moving accidents by flood and field. She lost herself delightedly in these self-created wanderings, and returned with unwilling spirit to the dull detail of common life. Poverty was the cloud that veiled her excellencies, and all that was good in her seemed about to perish from want of the genial dew of affection. She had not even the same advantage as I in the recollection of her parents. She clung to me, her brother, as her only friend, but her alliance with me completed the distance that her protectors felt for her, and every error was magnified by them into crimes. If she had been bred in that sphere of life to which, by inheritance, the delicate framework of her mind and person was adapted, she would have been the object almost of adoration, for her virtues were as eminent as her defects. All the genius that ennobled the blood of her father illustrated hers. A generous tide flowed in her veins. Artifice, envy, or meanness were at the antipodes of her nature. Her countenance, when enlightened by amiable feeling, might have belonged to a queen of nations. Her eyes were bright, her look fearless. Although by our situation and dispositions we were almost equally cut off from the usual forms of social intercourse, we formed a strong contrast to each other. I always required the stimulants of companionship and applause. Perdita was all sufficient to herself. Notwithstanding my lawless habits, my disposition was sociable, hers recluse. My life was spent among tangible realities, hers was a dream. I might be said even to love my enemies, since by exciting me, they in a sort bestowed happiness upon me. Perdita almost disliked her friends, for they interfered with her visionary moods. All my feelings, even of exultation and triumph, were changed to bitterness if unparticipated. Perdita, even in joy, fled to loneliness, and could go on from day to day, neither expressing her motions nor seeking a fellow feeling in another mind. Nay, she could love and dwell with tenderness on the look and voice of her friend, while her demeanour expressed the coldest reserve. A sensation with her became a sentiment, and she never spoke until she had mingled her perceptions of outward objects with others which were the native growth of her own mind. She was like a fruitful soil that imbibed the airs and dews of heaven, and gave them forth again to light in loveliest forms of fruits and flowers. But then she was often dark and rugged as that soil, raked up and new sown with unseen seed. She dwelt in a cottage whose trim glass plat sloped down the waters of the lake of Ulswater. A beech wood stretched up the hill behind, and a purling brook gently falling from the acclivity ran through poplar-shaded banks into the lake. I lived with a farmer whose house was built higher up among the hills. A dark crag rose behind it, and, exposed to the north, the snow lay in its crevices, and summer through. Before dawn, I led my flock to the sheep walks and guarded them through the day. It was a life of toil, for rain and cold were more frequent than sunshine. But it was my pride to contemn the elements. My trusty dog watched the sheep as I slipped away to the rendezvous of my comrades, and thence to the accomplishment of our schemes. At noon we met again, and we threw away in contempt our peasant fare, as we built our fireplace and kindled the cheering blaze, destined to cook the game stolen from the neighbouring preserves. Then came the tale of hairbreadth escapes, combats with dogs, ambush and flight, as gypsy-like we encompassed our pot, the search after a stray lamb, or the devices by which we elude or endeavoured to elude punishment, filled up the hours of afternoon. In the evening, my flock went to its fold, and I to my sister. It was seldom indeed that we escaped, to use an old-fashioned phrase, scot-free. Our dainty fare was often exchanged for blows and imprisonment. Once, when 13 years of age, I was sent for a month to the county jail. I came out, my morals unimproved, my hatred to my oppressors increased tenfold. Bread and water did not tame my blood, nor solitary confinement inspire me with gentle thoughts. I was angry, impatient, miserable. My only happy hours were those during which I devised schemes of revenge. These were perfected in my forced solitude, so that during the whole of the following season, and I was freed in early September, I never failed to provide excellent and plenteous fare for myself and my comrades. This was a glorious winter. The sharp frost and heavy snows tamed the animals and kept the country gentlemen by their firesides. We got more game than we could eat, and my faithful dog grew sleek upon our refuse. Thus years passed on, and years only added fresh love of freedom and contempt for all that was not as wild and rude as myself. At the age of 16, I had shot up in appearance to a man's estate. I was tall and athletic. I was practised to feats of strength and inured to the inclemency of the elements. My skin was embrowned by the sun. My step was firm, with conscious power. I feared no man and loved none. In afterlife, I looked back with wonder to what I was then, how utterly worthless I should have become if I had pursued my lawless career. My life was like that of an animal, and my mind was in danger of degenerating into that which forms brute nature. Until now, my savage habits had done me no radical mischief. My physical powers had grown up and flourished under their influence, and my mind, undergoing the same discipline, was imbued with all the hardy virtues. But now my boasted dependence was daily instigating me to acts of tyranny, and freedom was becoming, licentiousness. I stood on the brink of manhood. Passions, strong as the trees of a forest, had already taken root within me, and were about to shadow with their noxious overgrowth my path of life. I panted for enterprises beyond my childish exploits, and formed distempered dreams of future action. I avoided my ancient comrades, and I soon lost them. They arrived at the age when they were sent to fulfill their destined situations in life, while I, an outcast, with none to lead or drive me forward, paused. The old began to point at me as an example, the young to wonder at me as a being distinct from themselves. I hated them, and began, last and worst degradation, to hate myself. I clung to my ferocious habits. Oh, I'm getting a bit emotional there. I clung to my ferocious habits, yet half despised them. I continued my war against civilization, and yet entertained a wish to belong to it. Is this hitting a raw nerve? I've always said this about Shelley. When I read Frankenstein, I remember saying to Mark, bloody hell, that's me. I can literally remember. Anyway, moving on. I revolved again and again all that I remembered my mother to have told me of my father's former life. I contemplated the few relics I possessed belonging to him, which spoke of greater refinement than could be found among the mountain cottages. But nothing in all this served me as a guide to lead me to another and pleasanter way of life. My father had been connected with nobles, but all I knew of such connection was subsequent neglect. The name of the king, he to whom my dying father had addressed his latest prayers, and who had barbarously slighted them, was associated only with the ideas of unkindness, injustice, and consequent resentment. I was born for something greater than I was, and greater I would become. But greatness, at least to my distorted perceptions, was no necessary associate of goodness, and my wild thoughts were unchecked by my moral considerations when they rioted in dreams of distinction. Thus I stood upon a pinnacle. A sea of evil rolled at my feet. I was about to precipitate myself into it, and rush like a torrent over all obstructions to the object of my wishes, when a stranger influence came over the current of my fortunes, and changed their boisterous course to what was in comparison like the gentle meanderings of a meadow encircling streamlet. Okay, that was chapter 1 and Shelley's introduction. Shall I keep going? He can't reply to me. I might have to have an adjustment. If I don't move after about 20 minutes, I seize up. I'll keep going. I've only got about another 50,000 things I should be doing. And then the book came through the letterbox. What's a girl supposed to do? Chapter 2. I lived far from the busy haunts of men, and the rumour of wars or political changes came worn to a mere sound to our mountain abodes. England had been the scene of momentous struggles during my early boyhood. In the year 2073, the last of its kings, the ancient friend of my father, had abdicated in compliance with the gentle force of remonstrances of his subjects, and a republic was instituted. Large estates were secured to the dethroned monarch and his family. Dethroned, sorry. He received the title of Earl of Windsor and Windsor Castle. An ancient royalty with its wide demenses were, some of these words are quite old and I'm a bit thick, were a part of his allotted wealth. He died soon after, leaving 2 children, a son and a daughter. The ex-queen, a princess of the House of Austria, had long impelled her husband to withstand the necessity of the times. She was haughty and fearless. She cherished a love of power and a bitter contempt for him who had despoiled himself of a kingdom. For her children's sake alone, she consented to remain, shorn of regality, a member of the English Republic. I'm going to move my little neck because it's hurting. When she became a widow, she turned all her thoughts to the educating her son Adrian, 2nd Earl of Windsor, so as to accomplish her ambitious ends, and which his mother's milk he imbibed, and was intended to grow up in the steady purpose of reacquiring his lost crown. Adrian was now 15 years of age. He was addicted to study and imbued beyond his years with learning and talent. Report said that he had already begun to thwart his mother's views and to entertain republican principles. However, this might be the haughty countess entrusted none with the secrets of her family tuition. Adrian was bred up in solitude and kept apart from the natural companions of his age and rank. Some unknown circumstance now induced his mother to send him from under her immediate tutelage, and we heard that he was about to visit Cumberland. 1,000 tales were rife, explanatory of the Countess of Windsor's conduct. None true, probably, but each day it became more certain that we should have the noble scion of the late regal house of England among us. There was a large estate with a mansion attached to it belonging to this family, at Ullswater. A large park was one of its appendages, laid out with great taste, and plentifully stocked with game. I had often made depredations on these preserves, and the neglected state of the property facilitated my incursions. When it was decided that the young Earl of Windsor should visit Cumberland, workmen arrived to put the house and grounds in order for his reception. The apartments were restored to their pristine splendour, and the park, all disrepairs restored, was guarded with unusual care. I was beyond measure disturbed by this intelligence. It roused all my dormant recollections, my suspended sentiments of injury, and gave rise to this new one of revenge. I could no longer attend to my occupations. All my plans and devices were forgotten. I seemed about to begin new life, and that under no good auspices. The tug of war, I thought, was now to begin. He would come triumphantly to the district to which my parent had fled broken-hearted. He would find the ill-fated offspring, bequeathed with such vain confidence to this royal father, miserable paupers, that he should know of our existence, and treat us near at hand with the same contumely which his father had practised in distance and absence, appeared to me the certain consequence of all that had gone before. Hold on. Thus then I should meet this titled stripling, the son of my father's friend. He would be hedged in by servants, nobles, and the sons of nobles. And the sons of nobles were his companions. All England rang with his name, and his coming, like a thunderstorm, was heard from far, while I, unlettered and unfashioned, should, if I came in contact with him, in the judgment of his courtly followers, bear evidence in my very person to the propriety of that ingratitude which had made me the degraded being I appeared. With my mind fully occupied by these ideas, I might be said, as if fascinated, to haunt the destined abode of the young Earl. I watched the progress of the improvements, and stood by the unlading waggons, as various articles of luxury brought from London were taken forth and conveyed into the mansion. I was part of the ex-Queen's plan to surround her son with princely magnificence. I beheld rich carpets and silken hangings, ornaments of gold, richly embossed metals, emblazoned furniture, and all the appendages of high rank arranged, so that nothing but what was regal in splendour should reach the eye of one of royal descent. I looked on these, I turned my gaze to my own mean dress. Whence sprang this difference? Whence but from ingratitude, from falsehood, from a dereliction on the part of the prince's father, of all noble sympathy and generous feeling. Doubtless he also, whose blood received a mingling tide from his proud mother, he, the acknowledged focus of the kingdom's wealth and nobility, had been taught to repeat my father's name with disdain, and to scoff at my just claims to protection. I strove to think that all this grandeur was but more glaring infamy, and that by planting his gold-enwoven flag beside my tarnished and tattered banner, he proclaimed not his superiority, but his debasement. Yet I envied him. His stud of beautiful horses, his arms of costly workmanship, the praise that attended him, the adoration, ready servitor, high place, and high esteem. I considered them as forcibly wrenched from me, and envied them all with novel and tormenting bitterness. To crown my vexation of spirit, Perdita, the visionary Perdita, seemed to awake to real life with transport when she told me that the Earl of Windsor was about to arrive. And this pleases you, I observed moodily. Indeed it does, Lionel, she replied. I quite long to see him. He is the descendant of our kings, the first noble of the land. Everyone admires and loves him, and they say that his rank is his least merit. He is generous, brave, and affable. You have learnt a pretty lesson, Perdita, and repeat it so literally that you forget the while the proofs we have of the Earl's virtues. His generosity to us is manifest in our plenty, his bravery in the protection he affords us, his affability in the notice he takes of us, his rank, his least merit, do you say? Why, all his virtues are derived from his situation only. Because he is rich, he is called generous. Because he is powerful, brave. Because he is well served, he is affable. Let them call him so. Let all England believe him to be thus. We know him. He is our enemy, our penniless, dastardly, arrogant enemy. If he were gifted with one particle of the virtues you call his, he would do justly by us. If it were only to show that he must strike, it would not be a fallen foe. His father injured my father, his father unassailable on his throne, dare despise him who only stooped beneath himself, when he deigned to associate with the royal ingrate. We, descendants from the one and the other, must be enemies also. He shall find that I can feel my injuries. He shall learn to dread my revenge. A few days after he arrived, every inhabitant of the most miserable cottage went to swell the stream of population that poured forth to meet him. Even Perdita, in spite of my late Philip, crept near the highway, to behold this idol of all hearts. I, driven half mad as I met party after party of the country people in their holiday best, descending the hills, escaped to their cloud-veiled summits, and looking on the sterile rocks about me, exclaimed, "They do not cry, 'Long live the Earl!' Nor when night came, accompanied by drizzling rain and cold, would I return home, for I knew that each cottage rang with the praises of Adrian. As I felt my limbs grow numb and chill, my pain served as food for my insane aversion. Nay, I almost triumphed in it, since it seemed to afford me reason and excuse my hatred for my unheeding adversary. All was attributed to him, for I confounded so entirely the idea of father and son that I forget that the latter might be wholly unconscious of his parents' neglect of us. And as I struck my aching head with my hand, I cried, "He shall hear of this. I will be revenged. I will not suffer like a spaniel. He shall know, beggar and friendless as I am, that I will not tamely submit to injury." Each day, each hour added to these exaggerated wrongs. His praises were so many adder's stings fixed in my vulnerable breast. If I saw him at a distance, riding a beautiful horse, my blood boiled with rage. The air seemed poisoned by his presence, and my very native English was changed to vile jargon, since every phrase I heard was coupled with his name and honour. I panted to relieve this painful heart-burning by some misdeed that should rouse him to a sense of my antipathy. It was the height of his offending that he should occasion in me such intolerable sensations, and not deign himself to afford any demonstration that he was aware that I even lived to feel them. It soon became known that Adrian took great delight in his park and preserves. He never sported, but spent hours in watching the tribes of lovely and almost tame animals with which it was stocked, and ordered that the greater care should be taken of them than ever. Here was an opening for my plans of offence, and I made use of it with all the brute impetuosity I derived from my active mode of life. I proposed the enterprise of poaching on his demesne to my few remaining comrades, who were the most determined and lawless of the crew. But they all shrunk from the peril, so I was left to achieve my revenge myself. At first, my exploits were unperceived. I increased in daring. Footsteps on the dewy grass, torn boughs, and marks of slaughter at length betrayed me to the gamekeepers. They kept better watch. I was taken and sent to prison. I entered its gloomy walls in a fit of triumphant ecstasy. "He feels me now," I cried, "and shall again and again." I passed but one day in confinement. In the evening I was liberated, as I was told, by the order of the Earl himself. This news precipitated me from my self-raised pinnacle of honour. He despises me, I thought, but he shall learn that I despise him, and hold in equal contempt his punishments and his clemency. On the second night after my release, I was again taken by the gamekeepers, again imprisoned, and again released. And again, such was my pertinacity, did the fourth night find me in the forbidden park. The gamekeepers were more enraged than their lord by my obstinacy. They had received orders that if I were there again, I should be brought to the Earl, and his lenity made me expect a conclusion which they considered ill befitting my crime. One of them, who had been from the first the leader among those who had seized me, resolved to satisfy his own resentment before he made me over to the higher powers. The late setting of the moon, and the extreme caution I was obliged to use in this my third expedition, consumed so much time that something like a qualm of fear came over me when I perceived dark night yield to twilight. I crept along by the fern on my hands and knees, seeking the shadowy coverts of the underwood, while the birds awoke with unwelcome song above, and the fresh morning wind playing among the boughs made me suspect a footfall at each turn. My heart beat quick as I approached the palings. My hand was on one of them. A leap would take me to the other side, when two keepers sprang from an ambush upon me. One knocked me down and proceeded to inflict a severe horsewhipping. I started up, a knife was in my grasp. I made a plunge at his raised right arm and inflicted a deep, wide wound in his hand. The rage and yells of the wounded man, the howling excretions of his comrade, which I answered with equal bitterness and fury, echoed through the dell. Morning broke more and more, ill accordant in its celestial beauty with our brute and noisy contest. I and my enemy were still struggling when the wounded man exclaimed, "The Earl!" I sprang out of the Herculean hold of the keeper, panting from my exertions. I cast furious glances on my persecutors, and placing myself with my back to a tree, resolved to defend myself to the last. My garments were torn, and they, as well as my hands, were stained with the blood of the man I had wounded. One hand grasped the dead birds, my hard-earned prey. The other held the knife. My hair was matted, my face besmeared with the same guilty signs that bore witness against me on the dripping instrument I clenched. My whole appearance was haggard and squalid. Tall and muscular as I was in form, I must have looked like, what indeed I was, the merest ruffian that ever trod the earth. The name of the Earl startled me, and caused all the indignant blood that warmed my heart to rush into my cheeks. I had never seen him before. I figured to myself a haughty, assuming youth who would take me to task if I deigned to speak, if he deigned speak with me, with all the arrogance of superiority. My reply was ready, a reproach I deemed calculated to sting his very heart. He came up the while, and his appearance blew aside, with gentle western breath, my cloudy wrath. A tall, slim, fair boy, with a physiognomy expressive of the excess of sensibility and refinement, stood before me. The morning sunbeams tinged with gold his silken hair, and spread light and glory over his beaming countenance. "How is this?" he cried. The men eagerly began their defence. He put them aside, saying, "Two of you at once on a mere lad, for shame." He came up to me. "Verney," he cried, "Lionel Verney, do we meet thus for the first time? Were we born to be friends to each other, and through ill fortune has divided us? Will you not acknowledge the hereditary bond of friendship which I trust will hereafter unite us?" As he spoke, his earnest eyes, fixed on me, seemed to read my very soul. My heart, my savage, revengeful heart, felt the influence of sweet benignity sink upon it, while his thrilling voice, like sweetest melody, awoke a mute echo within me, stirring to its depth the life-blood in my frame. I desired to reply, to acknowledge his goodness, accept his proffered friendship, but words, fitting words, were not afforded to the rough mountaineer. I would have held out my hand, but its guilty stain restrained me. Adrian took pity on my faltering mien. "Come with me," he said. "I have much to say to you. Come home with me. You know who I am." "Yes," I exclaimed. "I do believe that I now know you, and that you will pardon my mistakes, my crime." Adrian smiled gently, and after giving his orders to the gamekeepers, he came up to me, putting his arm in mine. We walked together to the mansion. It was not his rank, after all that I have said. Surely it will not be suspected that it was Adrian's rank that from the first subdued my heart of hearts and laid my entire spirit prostrate before him. Nor was it I alone who felt thus intimately his perfections. His sensibility and courtesy fascinated everyone. His vivacity, intelligence, and active spirit of benevolence completed the conquest. Even at this early age, he was deep-read and imbued with the spirit of high philosophy. This spirit gave a tone of irresistible persuasion to his intercourse with others, so that he seemed like an inspired musician who struck with the unerring skill the lyre of mind, and produced thence divine harmony. In person, he hardly appeared of this world. His slight frame was over-informed by the soul that dwelt within. He was all mind, man but a rush against his breast, and it would have conquered his strength. but the might of his smile would have tamed a hungry lion, or caused a legion of armed men to lay their weapons at his feet. I spent the day with him. At first he did not recur to the past, or indeed to any personal occurrences. He wished probably to inspire me with confidence, and give me time to gather together my scattered thoughts. He talked of general subjects, and gave me ideas I had never before conceived. Hold on a minute. We sat in his library, and he spoke of the Greek sages, and of the power which they had acquired over the minds of men, through the force of love and wisdom only. The room was decorated with the busts of many of them, and he described their characters to me. As he spoke, I felt subject to him, and all my boasted pride and strength were subdued by the honeyed accents of this blue-eyed boy. The trim and pale demesnes of civilization, which I had before regarded from my wild jungle as inaccessible, had its wicket opened by him. I stepped within, and felt as I entered that I trod my native soil. As evening came on, he reverted to the past. I have a tale to relate, he said, and much explanation to give concerning the past. Perhaps you can assist me to curtail it. Do you remember your father? I had never the happiness of seeing him, but his name is one of my earliest recollections. He stands written in my mind's tablets as a type of all that was gallant, amenable, and fascinating man. His wit was not more conspicuous than the overflowing goodness of his heart, which he poured in such full measure on his friends as to leave, alas, small remnant for himself. Encouraged by his encomium, I proceeded, in answer to his inquiries, to relate what I remembered of my parent, and he gave an account of those circumstances which had brought about a neglect of my father's testamentary letter. When, in after times, Adrian's father, then King of England, felt his situation become more perilous, his line of conduct more embarrassed, again and again he wished for his early friend, who might stand a mound against the impetuous anger of his queen, a mediator between him and the Parliament. From the time that he had quitted London on the fatal night of his defeat at the gaming table, the king had received no tidings concerning him, and when, after the lapse of years, he exerted himself to discover him, every trace was lost. With fonder regret than ever, he clung to his memory, and gave it in charge to his son, if ever he should meet this valued friend, in his name to bestow every succour, and to assure him that, to the last, his attachment survived separation in silence. A short time before Adrian's visit to Cumberland, the heir of the nobleman to whom my father had confided his last appeal to his royal master put this letter, its seal unbroken, into the young earl's hands. It had been found cast aside with a mass of papers of old date. An accident alone brought it to light. Adrian read it with deep interest. Hold on. And found there that living spirit of genius and wit he had so often heard commemorated. He discovered the name of the spot whither my father had retreated, and where he died. He learnt the existence of his orphan children, and during the short interval between his arrival at Ullswater and our meeting in the park, he had been occupied in making inquiries concerning us, and arranging a variety of plans for our benefit, preliminary to his introducing himself to our notice. The mode in which he spoke of my father was gratifying to my vanity. The veil which he delicately cast over his benevolence in alleging a duteous fulfilment of the king's latest will was soothing to my pride. Other feelings, less ambiguous, were called into play by his conciliating manner and the generous warmth of his expressions. Respect, rarely before experienced, admiration and love. He had touched my rocky heart with his magic power, and the stream of affection gushed forth, imperishable and pure. In the evening we parted. He pressed my hand. We shall meet again. Come to me tomorrow. I clasped that kind hand. I tried to answer a fervent God bless you, was all my ignorance could frame of speech, and I darted away, oppressed by my new emotions. I could not rest. I sought the hills. A west wind swept them, and the stars glittered above. I ran on, careless of outward objects, but trying to master the struggling spirit within me by means of bodily fatigue. This, I thought, is power, not to be strong of limb, hard of heart, ferocious and daring, but kind and compassionate and soft. Stopping short, I clasped my hands, and with the fervour of a new proselyte, cried, "Doubt me not, Adrian, I also will become wise and good." And then, quite overcome, I wept aloud. As this gust of passion passed from me, I felt more composed. I lay on the ground, and giving the reins to my thoughts, repassed in my mind my former life, and began fold by fold to unwind the many errors of my heart, and to discover how brutish, savage, and worthless I had hitherto been. I could not, however, at the time feel remorse, for methought I was born anew. My soul threw off the burthen of past sin, to commence a new career in innocence and love. Nothing harsh nor rough remained to jar with the soft feelings which the transactions of the day had inspired. I was as a child lisping its devotions after its mother, and my plastic soul was remoulded by a master hand which I neither desired nor was able to resist. This was the first commencement of my friendship with Adrian, and I must commemorate this day as the most fortunate of my life. I now began to be human. I was admitted within that sacred boundary which divides the intellectual and moral nature of man from that which characterizes animals. My best feelings were called into play to give fitting responses to the generosity, wisdom, and amenity of my new friend. He, with a noble goodness of his own, took infinite delight in bestowing to prodigality the treasures of his mind and fortune on the long neglected son of his father's friend, the offspring of that gifted being whose excellencies and talents he had heard commemorated from infancy. After his abdication, the late king had retreated from the sphere of politics, yet his domestic circle afforded him small content. The ex-queen had none of the virtues of domestic life, and those of courage and daring which she possessed were rendered null by the succession of her husband. She despised him and did not care to conceal her sentiments. The king had, in compliance with her exactions, cast off his old friends, but he had acquired no new ones under her guidance. In this dearth of sympathy, he had recourse to his almost infant son, and the early development of talent and sensibility rendered Adrian no unfitting depository of his father's confidence. He was never weary of listening to the latter's often repeated accounts of old times, in which my father had played a distinguished part. His keen remarks were repeated to the boy, and remembered by him. His wit, his fascinations, his very faults were hallowed by the regret of affection. His loss was sincerely deplored. Even the Queen's dislike of the favourite was ineffectual to deprive him of his son's admiration. It was bitter, sarcastic, contemptuous. My pillow's falling on the floor. I'm lost. Nor did her anger, dislike prevent Adrian from imagining my father, as he had said, the type of all that was gallant, amiable, and fascinating in man. It was not strange, therefore, that when he heard of the existence of the offspring of the celebrated person, he should have formed the plan of bestowing on them all the advantages his rank made him rich to afford. When he found me a vagabond, shepherd of the hills, a poacher, an unlettered savage, still his kindness did not fail. In addition to the opinion he entertained that his father was to a degree culpable of neglect towards us, and that he was bound to every possible reparation, he was pleased to say that under all my ruggedness and glimmered forth an elevation of spirit, which could be distinguished from mere animal courage, and that I inherited a similarity of countenance to my father, which gave proof that all his virtues and talents had not died with him. Whatever those might be which descended to me, my noble young friend resolved should not be lost for want of culture. Acting upon this plan in our subsequent intercourse, he led me to wish to participate in that cultivation which graced his own intellect. My active mind, when once it seized upon this new idea, fastened on it with extreme avidity. At first, it was the great object of my ambition to rival the merits of my father and render myself worthy of the friendship of Adrian. But curiosity soon awoke, and my earnest love of knowledge, which caused me to pass days and nights in reading and study. I was already well acquainted with what I may term the panorama of nature, the change of seasons, and the various appearances of heaven and earth. But I was at once startled and enchanted by my sudden extension of vision, when the curtain which had been drawn before the intellectual world was withdrawn, and I saw the universe, not only as it presented itself to my outward senses, but as it had appeared to the wisest among men. Poetry and its creations, philosophy and its researches and classifications, alike awoke the sleeping ideas in my mind and gave me new ones. I felt as a sailor who from the topmast first discovered the shore of America, and like him I hastened to tell my companions of my discoveries in unknown regions. But I was unable to excite in any beast the same craving appetite for knowledge that existed in mine. Even Perdita was unable to understand me. I had lived in what is generally called the world of reality, and it was awakening to a new country to find that there was a deeper meaning in all I saw, besides that which my eyes conveyed to me. The visionary Perdita beheld in all this only a new gloss upon my old reading, and her own was sufficiently inexhaustible to content her. She listened to me as she had done to my narration of my adventures, and sometimes took an interest in this species of information, but she did not, as I did, look out on it as an integral part of her being, which having obtained, I could no more put off than a universal sense of touch. We both agreed in loving Adrian, although she, not having yet escaped from childhood, could not appreciate, as I did, the extent of his merits, or feel the same sympathy in his pursuits and opinions. I was for ever with him. There was a sensibility and sweetness in his disposition that gave a tender and an earthy tone to our converse. Then he, as gay as a lark, carolling from its skyry tower, soaring in thought as an eagle, innocent as a mild-eyed dove, he could dispel the seriousness of Perdita and take the sting from the torturing activity of my nature. I looked back to my restless desires and painful struggles with my fellow beings to a troubled dream, and felt myself as much changed as if I had transmigrated into another form, whose fresh sensorium and mechanism of nerves had altered the reflection of the apparent universe in the mirror of mind. But it was not so. I was the same in strength, in earnest craving for sympathy, in my yearning for active exertion. Wait a minute. I need to move about a bit. Oh my bloody God. My manly virtues did not desert me, for the witch Urania spared the locks of Samson while he reposed at her feet, but all was softened and humanized. Nor did Adrian instruct me only in the cold truths of history and philosophy. At the same time that he taught me by their means to subdue my own reckless and uncultured spirit, he opened to my view the living page of his own heart, and gave me to feel and understand its wondrous character. The ex-Queen of England had, even during infancy, endeavoured to implant daring and ambitious designs in the mind of her son. She saw that he was endowed with genius and surpassing talent. These she cultivated for the sake of afterwards using them for the furtherance of her own views. She encouraged his craving for knowledge and his impetuous courage. She even tolerated his tameless love of freedom, under the hope that this would, as is too often the case, lead to a passion for command. She endeavoured to bring him up in a sense of resentment towards and a desire to revenge himself upon those who had been instrumental in bringing about his father's abdication. In this she did not succeed. The accounts furnished him, however distorted, of a great and wise nation asserting its right to govern itself, excited its admiration. In early days he became a republican from principle. Still his mother did not despair. To the love of rule and haughty pride of birth, she added determined ambition, patience, and self-control. She devoted herself to the study of her son's disposition. By the application of praise, censure, and exhortation, she tried to seek and strike the fitting chords, and through the melody that followed her touch seemed discord to her. She built her hopes on his talents, and felt sure that she would at last win him. The kind of banishment he now experienced arose from other causes. The ex-queen had also a daughter, now 12 years of age, his fairy sister. Adrian was wont to call her, a lovely animated little thing, all sensibility and truth. With these, her children, the noble widow constantly resided at Windsor. She admitted no visitors except her own partisans, travellers from her native Germany, and a few of the foreign ministers. Among these, and highly distinguished by her, was Prince Zami, ambassador to England from the Free States of Greece, and his daughter, the young Princess Evadne, passed much of her time at Windsor Castle, in company with this sprightly and clever Greek girl. The Countess would relax from her usual state. Her views with regard to her own children placed all her words and actions relative to them under restraint. But Evadne was a plaything she could in no way fear, nor were her talents and vivacity slight elevations to the monotony of the Countess's life. Evadne was 18 years of age. Although they spent much time together at Windsor, the extreme youth of Adrian prevented any suspicion as to the nature of their intercourse. But he was ardent and tender of heart beyond the common nature of man, and had already learnt to love, while the beauteous Greek smiled benignantly on the boy. It was strange to me, who, though older than Adrian, had never loved, to witness the whole heart sacrifice of my friend. There was neither jealousy, inquietude, or mistrust in his sentiment. It was devotion and faith. His life was swallowed up in the existence of his beloved, and his heart beat only in unison with the pulsations that vivified hers. This was a secret law of his life. He loved and was beloved. The universe was to him a dwelling, to inhabit with his chosen one, and not either a scheme of society or an enchantment of events that could impact to him either happiness or misery. What through life and the system of social intercourse were a wilderness, a tiger-hunted jungle. Through the midst of its errors, in the depth of its savage recesses, there was a disentangled and flowery pathway through which they might journey in safety and delight. Their track would be like the passage of the Red Sea, which they might traverse with unwet feet through a wall of destruction were impending on either side. Alas, why must I record the hapless delusion of this matchless specimen of humanity? What is there in our nature that is for ever urging us on towards pain and misery? We are not formed for enjoyment, and, however we may be attuned to the reception of pleasurable emotion, disappointment is the never-failing pilot of our life's bark, and ruthlessly carries us on to the shoals. Who was better framed than this highly gifted youth to love and be beloved, and to reap inalienable joy from an unblamed passion? If his heart had slept but a few years longer, he might have been saved, but it awoke in its infancy. It had power, but no knowledge, and it was ruined, even as a too early blowing bud is nipped by the killing frost. I did not accuse Evadne of hypocrisy or a wish to deceive her lover, but the first letter that I saw of hers convinced me that she did not love him. It was written with elegance, and, foreigner as she was, with great command of language. The handwriting itself was exquisitely beautiful. There was something in her very paper and its folds which even I, who do not love, and was withal unskilled in such matters, could discern as being tasteful. There was much kindness, gratitude, and sweetness in her expression, but no love. Evadne was 2 years older than Adrian, and who at 18 ever loved one so much their junior? I compared her placid epistles with the burning ones of Adrian. His soul seemed to distill itself into the words he wrote, and they breathed on the paper, bearing with them a portion of the life of love which was his life. The very writing used to exhaust him, and he would weep over them, merely from the excess of emotion they awakened in his heart. Adrian's soul was painted in his countenance, and concealment of deceit were at the antipodes to the dreadless frankness of his nature. Evadne made it her earnest request that the tale of their loves should not be revealed to his mother, and after, for a while, contesting the point, he yielded it to her. A vain concession, his demeanour quickly betrayed his secret to the quick eyes of the ex-queen. With the same wary prudence that characterized her whole conduct, she concealed her discovery, but hastened to remove her son from the sphere of the attractive Greek. He was sent to Cumberland, but the plan of correspondence between the lovers, arranged by Evadne, was effectually hidden from her. Thus the absence of Adrian, concerted for the purpose of separating, united them in firmer bonds than ever. To me, he discoursed ceaselessly of his beloved Ionium. Her country, its ancient annals, its late memorable struggles, were all made to partake in her glory and excellence. He submitted to be away from her because she commanded this submission, but for her influence he would have declared his attachment before all England, and resisted with unshaken constancy his mother's opposition. Evadne's feminine prudence perceived how useless any assertion of his resolves would be, till added years gave weight to his power. Perhaps there was besides a lurking dislike to bind itself in the face of the world to one whom she did not love at least with that passionate enthusiasm which her heart told her she might one day feel towards another. He obeyed her injunctions and passed a year in exile in Cumberland. Right, that's enough. That's 2 chapters and an introduction. And I'm going to try and do some more tomorrow. And like I say, I'm doing it on a live stream because it saves uploading it, which takes hours. So we will carry on reading this, which isn't... Oh, hold on. The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which we're promised is an apocalyptic fantasy of the end of human civilization. So we'll begin again tomorrow. Bye, everybody.